Everyone at the fish market whispered about her. While every other vendor's fish swarmed with flies, hers remained untouched. What they didn't know would change everything. The truth was darker than anyone imagined. This is the story of Maria Elena, and the terrible bargain she made to save her daughter's soul. The morning sun barely kissed the concrete floors of Riverside Fish Market when Maria Elena arrived, her weathered hands gripping a single ice chest that seemed too light for someone in the fish business. Around her, vendors hauled massive coolers, their backs bent under the weight of their daily catch. But Maria Elena moved differently, quietly, almost like she was carrying something sacred instead of seafood. By 7 a.m., the market buzzed with the familiar chaos of haggling voices and slamming ice lids. Flies descended like tiny vultures, drawn by the smell of fresh fish laid out on beds of crushed ice. They swarmed every stall with religious devotion, creating black clouds above the red snappers, dancing around the silver mackerel, settling thick as carpet on anything that had once swum in the sea. Every stall except Maria Elena's. Her fish lay pristine on their ice beds, beautiful red snappers with eyes still clear as glass, yellowtail that gleamed like jewelry, grouper steaks cut thick and perfect. Not a single fly dared approach. They seemed to hit an invisible wall 3 feet from her stand, circling in confused spirals before buzzing away to torment her neighbors. "It ain't natural," whispered Carmen from the next stall, swatting at the cloud of insects that had abandoned Maria Elena's fish to feast on hers. 40 years I've been selling fish and I ain't never seen nothing like it." Old Roberto, whose family had worked this market for 3 generations, shook his head while brushing flies off his snapper. "My grandmother used to tell stories about people like her. Said they carried death so close that even the flies could smell it." The whispers spread like ripples on water. Customer after customer noticed the strange phenomenon. They'd approach Maria Elena's stall, drawn by the impossible cleanliness of her display, then pause. Something felt different here. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. "How much for the grouper?" asked Mrs. Patterson, a regular who'd been coming to the market for 20 years. $12 a pound, Maria Elena replied, her voice soft but clear. She had kind eyes, the sort that had seen too much but still held compassion. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she wrapped the fish, never hurrying, never fumbling. Mrs. Patterson paid and left, but not before glancing back with that look people get when they sense a mystery they can't solve. The look that says they'll be talking about this later, trying to piece together something that doesn't fit the normal rules of the world. By noon, the other vendors had formed their own theories. Some said Maria Elena used chemicals, illegal sprays that kept the flies away but probably poisoned the fish. Others whispered about voodoo or Santeria, pointing to the small silver pendant that hung around her neck, catching the light when she moved. "I heard she lost her whole family in that hurricane 5 years back," Carmen murmured to Roberto while they watched Maria Elena serve another customer with that same gentle efficiency. "Maybe grief changes you somehow. Makes you different." But the most disturbing theory came from young Miguel, Roberto's grandson, who just started working the market. "What if the flies know something we don't?" he said, his voice barely audible above the market noise. "What if they can sense things about people? Things that ain't right?" The question hung in the salt-tinged air like a curse. Because everyone who worked that market knew the truth about flies, they were drawn to decay, to death, to the ending of things. They could smell rot before humans even knew it existed. So what did it mean when they fled from a person like she carried the plague? As the afternoon wore on, Maria Elena continued her work with quiet dignity, seemingly unaware of the stares and whispers. She cleaned her knives with methodical precision, arranged her remaining fish with an artist's eye for beauty, and treated every customer with the same gentle respect. But sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her hand would drift to that silver pendant at her throat, and her eyes would grow distant, as if she was remembering something that hurt too much to forget. In those moments, the air around her seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, and even the boldest flies would veer away as if they'd hit a wall of invisible flame. The market began to empty as evening approached, but the mystery remained, heavier now than the humid coastal air. Tomorrow would bring more whispers, more theories, more sideways glances at the woman whose fish defied the natural order of things. If only they knew the truth. If only they understood that some secrets are too dangerous to speak aloud, and some prices too terrible to imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Maria Elena first appeared at Riverside Market, and the whispers had grown into accusations. The other vendors no longer bothered to lower their voices when they talked about her. Their resentment had fermented like fruit left too long in the sun, turning sweet curiosity into bitter suspicion. "She's stealing our customers," Carmen complained to anyone who'd listen, her voice sharp with frustration. People come here now just to see the freak show, then buy from her because her fish look cleaner. It ain't fair competition when you're using black magic. The word, magic, had started appearing more frequently in their conversations. Black magic. Witchcraft. Deals with the devil. The theories grew more elaborate and more cruel with each telling, fed by fear of the unknown and the very human need to explain what couldn't be understood. Maria Elena heard every word. She saw how customers hesitated before approaching her stall, drawn by the perfect presentation but repelled by the stories they'd heard. She watched children point at her from behind their mother's skirts, their eyes wide with the delicious terror of encountering something their young minds couldn't categorize. But what hurt most were the looks of disgust from people who'd once been friendly. Mrs. Patterson, who'd bought fish from her that first day, now crossed to the other side of the market when she saw Maria Elena. The young mothers who used to smile and ask about her family now pulled their children closer and hurried past without making eye contact. The isolation was crushing, but Maria Elena endured it because she had no choice. The pendant around her neck grew warm against her skin whenever the whispers got particularly vicious, reminding her why she bore this burden. Reminding her of the promise she'd made and the price she'd agreed to pay. During her lunch break, she'd sit alone on the concrete bench behind the market, eating a simple sandwich while watching the seagulls fight over scraps. Sometimes other vendors would pass by, their conversation stopping abruptly when they saw her, their voices resuming in hushed tones once they thought they were out of earshot. "I heard she talks to herself at night," she overheard Miguel saying to his girlfriend. "Roberto says he saw her at the harbor after midnight, just standing there talking to the water like something was talking back." Maria Elena's chest tightened. Roberto wasn't wrong, she did go to the harbor at night. But she wasn't talking to the water. She was talking to her daughter, Sophia, whose voice came to her in the sound of waves against the dock, whose presence she felt most strongly in those quiet hours between darkness and dawn. The memory of that terrible night 5 years ago still haunted her dreams. Hurricane Isabella had torn through their coastal town like God's own fury, turning homes into matchsticks and lives into statistics. Maria Elena had lost everything, her husband Carlos, her teenage son Diego, and worst of all her 8-year-old Sophia, whose body was never found despite weeks of searching. The grief had nearly destroyed her. 4 months she'd existed in a fog of medication and despair, unable to eat, unable to work, unable to imagine a future without her family's laughter filling her small house. The settlement money from FEMA had paid the bills, but it couldn't touch the emptiness that had taken root in her chest like a cancer. Then came the night when everything changed. She'd been sitting on the harbor dock, seriously considering whether life was worth living without the people who'd made it meaningful. The water had looked so peaceful, so welcoming. She'd been ready to slip beneath its surface and find whatever peace might exist on the other side of breathing. That's when she heard Sophia's voice, clear as if her daughter was sitting right beside her. "Mama, don't leave me. I'm trapped, Mama. I can't find the light because something's holding me here. Something dark and hungry that feeds on the sadness of families like ours." Maria Elena had thought she was losing her mind. Grief could do that to people. She'd heard stories of parents who talked to dead children, who saw their faces in crowds, who built entire fantasy worlds rather than accept the reality of loss. But Sophia's voice had been so real, so desperate. "There's a way to help me, Mama. But it means you'll have to carry something heavy for the rest of your life. The thing that feeds on our sadness. It marks people. That's why the flies stay away from you now. They can smell its touch on your soul." The explanation had come in fragments over several nights, pieces of a puzzle too terrible to assemble all at once. The entity that had claimed Sophia wasn't death itself, but something that fed on the spaces between life and death, growing stronger on the grief of those left behind. It had been drawn to their town by the hurricane, gorging itself on the collective trauma of hundreds of families torn apart by wind and water. Sophia was trapped in that in-between space, unable to move on because the entity needed her suffering to maintain its hold on the living world. But there was a way to free her. Someone had to take on the entity's mark willingly, becoming a beacon that would draw it away from the trapped souls and give them a chance to find peace. The cost was everything Maria Elena had left of a normal life. The mark would make her different, separate from the living world in ways that even flies could sense. She would become a walking reminder of death's proximity, carrying the entity's essence in her very cells until her own life ended and broke the contract. But Sophia would be free. The other souls trapped by the entity would be free. And maybe, if Maria Elena was strong enough to bear the burden without breaking, she could prevent other families from suffering the same loss. The choice had been no choice at all. The night Maria Elena made her decision, the harbor had been shrouded in fog so thick she could barely see her own hands. She'd knelt on the weathered planks of the dock, Sophia's voice guiding her through the ritual that would seal their bargain and change her forever. Put your hand in the water, Mama. Feel for the coldest spot, that's where it's waiting. Maria Elena had hesitated for just a moment. The rational part of her mind screamed that she was having a complete psychological breakdown, that dead children don't give instructions, that entities from beyond don't make deals with grieving mothers. But the desperate part of her, the part that would do anything to help her lost daughter, pushed her hand into the icy harbor water. The cold had been shocking, but not as shocking as the sensation of something wrapping around her wrist like fingers made of liquid shadow. The touch had burned and frozen simultaneously, sending waves of agony up her arm that made her gasp and nearly pull back. Don't let go, Mama. It has to mark you willingly, or the bargain won't hold. So Maria Elena had held on, tears streaming down her face as the entity's essence flowed into her bloodstream like ice water mixed with electricity. She'd felt it settling into her bones, her organs, her DNA, rewriting the fundamental code that made her human and replacing it with something else, something that existed partially in the world of the living and partially in the realm of the dead. The process had taken hours. By the time the sun rose, Maria Elena was no longer entirely herself. She could feel the entity's presence coiled around her heart like a sleeping serpent, dormant but undeniably present. The silver pendant around her neck, a communion gift from Sophia's first religious ceremony, had grown warm and would remain warm for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the contract she'd signed in blood and water. But Sophia was free. Maria Elena had felt her daughter's presence lift away like morning mist, finally able to find the light that would carry her to whatever peace awaited beyond the veil. The last words she'd heard were whispered with infinite love and gratitude. Thank you, Mama. I love you forever. The other trapped souls had followed, dozens of them, all the victims of the entity's hunger who'd been caught in that terrible space between worlds. Maria Elena had felt each one pass through her as they found their freedom, their relief washing over her like warm rain. For just a moment, she'd experienced a joy so profound it almost compensated for the alien presence now sharing her body. Almost. The first sign of her transformation had been the flies. Every insect that relied on the scent of decay to find food now avoided her as if she carried a plague. They could sense the entity's mark on her soul, recognizing it as something far more dangerous than simple death. Death was natural, part of the cycle they served. What lived inside Maria Elena now was something else entirely, a disruption in the natural order that even the humblest creatures instinctively feared. The second sign had been the way her fish stayed fresh. The entity's presence acted like a preservative, slowing the decay process and keeping her merchandise pristine long after it should have spoiled. It was a practical benefit that helped her make a living, but it also made her stand out in ways that drew unwanted attention. The third sign was the dreams. Every night, Maria Elena experienced visions of the entity's true nature, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, feeding on the electromagnetic energy generated by intense grief. She saw its other hosts throughout history, all the people who'd made similar bargains to save their loved ones from its eternal feast. Some had been burned as witches. Others had been ostracized as cursed. A few had been worshipped as holy figures who could commune with the dead. All had lived lonely lives, set apart from humanity by the weight of what they carried. But they'd all made the same choice Maria Elena had made, because love for their families had been stronger than fear of isolation. They'd chosen to sacrifice their own happiness to ensure their children, spouses, or parents could find peace in death. The entity wasn't evil in any traditional sense, it was simply a force of nature like a hurricane or earthquake. It fed on what was available, following its own alien logic in ways humans couldn't fully understand. But it could be reasoned with, bargained with, if someone was willing to pay the price it demanded. Maria Elena had paid that price gladly, but living with the consequences was harder than she'd imagined. The physical changes were manageable. The slightly lower body temperature, the way her hair had started growing faster, the fact that small cuts healed in minutes instead of days. But the social isolation was slowly killing her in ways the entity never could. She'd moved to Riverside after her transformation, hoping to start fresh where no one knew her story. But the mark she carried was impossible to hide completely. People sensed something different about her, something that made them uncomfortable without being able to explain why. The vendors at the fish market had started as friends, welcoming her with the easy camaraderie of people who worked hard for honest livings. But friendship required trust, and trust required understanding, and Maria Elena could never fully explain who she really was or why she lived the way she did. So she endured their whispers and suspicions, carrying her secret like a stone in her chest, because the alternative was breaking the bargain and condemning her daughter's soul to eternal captivity. Some burdens were too important to put down, no matter how much they hurt to carry. The confrontation had been building for weeks like a summer storm, all electric tension and dark clouds on the horizon. It finally broke on a Tuesday morning when Carmen arrived at the market to find 3 of her regular customers lined up at Maria Elena's stall instead of her own. "That's it," Carmen announced, her voice carrying across the concrete floor like a battle cry. "I've had enough of this witch stealing our business with her unnatural tricks." She marched over to Maria Elena's stall with Roberto and Miguel flanking her like soldiers preparing for war. Other vendors stopped their morning preparations to watch, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the early customers paused their shopping, drawn by the crackling tension in the air. "I want to know what you're using," Carmen demanded, jabbing her finger toward Maria Elena's perfectly arranged fish. "What kind of chemicals are you spraying on them? What kind of poison are you putting in our market?" Maria Elena looked up from her ice arrangement, her expression calm but guarded. The pendant at her throat had grown warm the moment Carmen started shouting, responding to the emotional energy like a barometer sensing an approaching storm. "I don't use any chemicals," she said quietly. "My fish are completely natural." "Natural?" Carmen's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Nothing about you is natural, lady. We've all seen what you do at night, talking to yourself down at the harbor like some kind of crazy person. We know you're not right in the head." A murmur ran through the growing crowd of onlookers. Mrs. Patterson had arrived for her weekly shopping and found herself witnessing what felt like a public trial. Young mothers pulled their children closer, sensing adult conflict that might turn ugly. "Leave me alone," Maria Elena said, her voice still soft but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "I've never done anything to hurt any of you." "You're hurting all of us just by being here," Roberto interjected, his weathered face set in hard lines. "People come to gawk at the freak show instead of buying from honest vendors. You're like a carnival act that's driving away real business." The words hit Maria Elena like physical blows. Freak show. The phrase echoed in her mind, dragging up memories of every cruel whisper she'd endured over the past months. She thought of Sophia, free and at peace because of the sacrifice she'd made, and tried to find strength in that knowledge. But the entity inside her was responding to the emotional turmoil, stirring in ways it hadn't since the night she'd first accepted its mark. She could feel it uncoiling around her heart like a snake tasting the air, drawn by the intensity of the confrontation. "Maybe you should find somewhere else to sell your fish," Miguel suggested, trying to sound reasonable but failing to hide the contempt in his voice. "Somewhere where people understand your special situation." "I have every right to be here," Maria Elena replied, but her voice was starting to shake. The pendant was growing hotter against her skin, and she could feel the entity's presence expanding, testing the boundaries of their contract. "Rights?" Carmen laughed again. "You want to talk about rights? We have the right to make an honest living without competing against someone who's clearly using supernatural help. We have the right to work in a place that doesn't give people the creeps." The crowd was growing larger, drawn by the spectacle of public humiliation. Maria Elena could see the hunger in their eyes, the same hunger that fed internet comment sections and reality TV shows, the human appetite for watching someone else's dignity get torn apart. But what broke her wasn't the cruelty of the vendors or the voyeurism of the customers. It was the sight of a little girl, maybe 8 years old, peeking out from behind her mother's legs with Sophia's exact same dark eyes and curious expression. For just a moment, Maria Elena saw her own daughter in that child's face, and the grief she'd been holding back for 5 years came rushing to the surface like water through a broken dam. The entity inside her responded to that surge of emotion like a plant reaching toward sunlight, suddenly fully awake and hungry. The temperature around Maria Elena's stall dropped by 10 degrees in the space of a heartbeat. The ice in her display cases began forming patterns that looked almost like reaching fingers. And for the first time since she'd accepted the entity's mark, flies appeared around her fish, not the normal flies that plagued the other vendors, but something else entirely. Something that moved with too much purpose and gleamed with an oily darkness that hurt to look at directly. The crowd stepped back as one, suddenly aware that they were in the presence of something far beyond their understanding. Carmen's face went pale, and even Roberto crossed himself like his grandmother had taught him to do when confronted with forces beyond the natural world. "Stay away from me," Maria Elena whispered, but her voice carried with unnatural resonance, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "All of you just stay away." She began packing her fish with movements that were too fast and too precise, her hands working with inhuman efficiency while the dark flies swirled around her like a living tornado. The entity was close to the surface now, ready to defend its host from the mob that threatened to break the delicate balance they'd maintained. But Maria Elena fought it back down, forcing the alien presence to retreat through sheer willpower and the desperate knowledge that losing control here would destroy everything she'd sacrificed to protect. The flies disappeared. The temperature returned to normal. The ice went back to being just ice. "I'll find somewhere else to sell," she said, her voice human again but hollow with defeat. "You won't have to see me anymore." She finished packing in silence while the crowd dispersed, their appetite for spectacle satisfied but leaving them with a lingering unease that would follow them home. Within 20 minutes, Maria Elena's stall was empty, her presence erased from the market as if she'd never been there at all. Only the little girl with Sophia's eyes remained, having slipped away from her mother to approach the abandoned space where something extraordinary had almost broken free. "Lady," she called out, but Maria Elena was already gone, carrying her burden toward whatever lonely place would accept her next. 6 months later, the Riverside Fish Market had returned to normal. Carmen's customers came back, Roberto's business stabilized, and Miguel learned to appreciate the simple frustration of dealing with ordinary flies that behaved according to the laws of nature. The strange woman who disrupted their world became just another story to tell newcomers, a cautionary tale about trusting people who seemed too good to be true. But Mrs. Patterson couldn't forget the look in Maria Elena's eyes during that final confrontation, the depth of pain that went far beyond simple embarrassment or anger. It was the look of someone carrying a weight too heavy for any human to bear alone, and it haunted her dreams for weeks after the incident. So when she saw the newspaper article about Hurricane Isabella's 5-year memorial service, she made the connection that had been nagging at her subconscious. Maria Elena Vasquez, one of the names on the list of survivors who'd lost their entire families. A woman whose 8-year-old daughter had been swept out to sea and never recovered. Mrs. Patterson drove to the memorial service that evening, not sure what she hoped to accomplish but unable to let the mystery rest. The harbor had been decorated with white flowers and candles, hundreds of tiny flames flickering in the salt breeze like stars fallen to earth. Families gathered to remember their lost loved ones, sharing stories and finding comfort in their shared grief. She found Maria Elena standing alone at the end of the pier, speaking softly to the water in Spanish. The words were too quiet to understand, but the tone was unmistakably that of a mother talking to her child, gentle, loving, full of the infinite patience that parenthood creates. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Patterson said, approaching carefully like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. "I'm sorry for what happened at the market. We didn't understand." Maria Elena turned, and Mrs. Patterson was shocked to see how much she'd aged in just 6 months. Her hair had gone completely gray, and lines had appeared around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens too heavy for any human frame. "You don't need to apologize," Maria Elena said, her voice carrying that same gentle quality it had always held. "People fear what they can't understand. It's natural. But what we did wasn't right. The way we treated you." Mrs. Patterson struggled for words that could bridge the gap between normal life and whatever extraordinary circumstances had shaped Maria Elena's existence. "I saw the memorial list. Your daughter, Sophia." The name was spoken like a prayer, full of love and loss in equal measure. She would have been 13 this year. Would have been starting high school, complaining about boys and makeup and all the things that seemed so important when the world was full of possibilities. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the candles flicker in the harbor breeze. Other families moved around them, lost in their own rituals of remembrance, but Mrs. Patterson felt like she and Maria Elena existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. "The flies," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "There was something different about you, wasn't there? Something that kept them away." Maria Elena's hand drifted to the silver pendant at her throat, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing over the past 5 years. When you lose someone you love to forces beyond your control, you do anything to help them find peace. Anything at all. It wasn't a complete explanation, but it was enough. Mrs. Patterson understood that some truths were too large and strange to fit into ordinary words, that some sacrifices could only be comprehended by the people brave enough to make them. "Where will you go now?" she asked. "North, I think. There's a fishing village in Maine where they're more accepting of unusual circumstances. Older communities sometimes have longer memories of the things that exist in the spaces between what people call normal." Maria Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a business card for the Riverside Market with an address written on the back in careful handwriting. "If you ever need to reach me," she said, "write to this address. The letter will find me no matter where I am. It's part of the arrangement I made." Mrs. Patterson took the card, noting how the paper felt slightly warm to the touch and seemed to shimmer faintly in the candlelight. "Will you be all right? Living alone, carrying whatever burden you've taken on?" For the first time since she'd known her, Maria Elena smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "I'm not alone," she said. "Sophia visits me in dreams now, free and happy and full of light. She tells me about the place where she's waiting, and sometimes she sings the lullabies I used to sing to her when she was little." She looked out over the harbor where white flowers floated like fallen stars on the dark water. "Every day I carry this weight is another day she spends in peace instead of trapped in the space between worlds. Every moment of isolation is worth her freedom. Love makes all sacrifices bearable, even the ones that last a lifetime." As if summoned by her words, a warm breeze swept across the harbor, carrying the scent of jasmine and childhood summers. For just an instant, Mrs. Patterson could have sworn she heard the sound of a young girl's laughter mixing with the gentle lapping of waves against the pier. Maria Elena heard it too, and her smile grew brighter. "She's here," she whispered. "She comes to the memorial services to let me know she's all right. That's the real gift of the bargain I made, not just freeing her, but knowing with absolute certainty that love continues beyond death, that the connections between parents and children can't be broken by anything as simple as mortality." Mrs. Patterson left the memorial service with tears in her eyes and a profound understanding of the extraordinary love that had shaped the strange events at Riverside Market. She never saw Maria Elena again, but sometimes, when she bought fish from Carmen's stall and noticed the ordinary flies doing their ordinary work, she remembered the woman who'd carried an impossible burden with quiet dignity. And sometimes, on nights when the harbor breeze carried the scent of jasmine, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for mothers brave enough to sacrifice everything for their children's peace, even when the world would never understand the true cost of their love. If only they had known why she didn't have flies on her fish. If only they had understood that some people carry weights too heavy for others to imagine, and that the deepest love sometimes demands the greatest sacrifices. But perhaps it was better that the truth remained hidden, carried by one woman through a lifetime of solitude, because some gifts are too precious to be diminished by explanation, and some love too pure to be judged by those who've never faced such impossible choices.